What impact does social justice activism have on the African American community? Let's first welcome to the stage Marissa Janae Johnson, a Seattle-based writer, entrepreneur, speaker, and organizer working in the intersections of politics, blackness, womanhood, and Christianity. She has previously organized within the Black Lives Matter movement and has also started a new initiative called the Phoenix Fighter. Not yet. It's okay. Phoenix Fighter also sounds awesome. Marissa controversially reached the national stage when she helped take over a Seattle rally for 2016 presidential candidate Bernie Sanders. She's been featured on MSNBC, Fox, BBC, and Vice, but more importantly, she was once compared to ISIS in a campaign ad video by Donald Trump. Welcome, Marissa. Next up, we have an unapologetically opinionated YouTube creator with over 350,000 fans. Mr. Derek Blackman, aka Some Black Guy. Save your applause. Coined himself a radical centrist and enjoys discussing social, racial, and political topics that affect and influence pop culture. And you may want to know that at one point he was jumped by 3 dudes for trying to break up a fight between 2 ladies. Welcome, Derek. And moderating this excellent conversation is an absolute ray of sunshine. I can attest to this. Brittany Simon is an alternative lifestyle educator focusing on BDSM, polyamorous, and queer relationships. She helps others balance political, religious, and cultural pressures while trying to live authentically happy lives. She is a gay superhero. Welcome, Brittany.
Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay, good. I was a little worried. So before we begin, I just want to say this is my first time on stage, so I'm a little nervous. But I'm really excited because I both enjoy Derek and Marissa's work, and I'm excited to talk about it today. The first thing I want to say is as much as I love crowd participation and I love your claps and yells, let's leave maybe opinions to a minimum because it distracts the speakers. I would like to start with you guys describing your experiences as black men and black women and how they may differ. Because I think sometimes we think because they're both black, they have the same experiences, but we know that's not true. So, Derek, would you like to go first?
Sure.
Sure.
I don't know, so I'm an individual, so I can only speak for myself, and when it comes to being a black male, right? Yeah. But when it comes to being a black male, I usually I don't focus on that as much. Usually it only comes up when somebody's kind of throwing it in my face or something, and I've lived in quite a few places and been accepted in most areas, and there are stigmas, but talking to people, getting to know them, they immediately see oh, I'm chill or something, and a lot of those things is just hearsay, and it's been good, and I know there's a vast array of differences, especially when it comes to being a woman and a black woman, and so I don't know much about that other than what my mother tells me, and she has a lot of opinions. She has a lot of opinions. And sometimes we even butt heads too, but it's just, we can always have a healthy conversation. But for the most part, everything is, it's all right. I enjoy being a black male in America. I really do.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Marissa?
Yeah.
Are you on?
Hold up. Yeah, sorry. It's a little low, so I have to look down. I don't want to look down. I've gone too much. I think when I was growing up, so background, I grew up with 2 really conservative religious parents, and I think growing up, I didn't really understand how my identities impacted my day-to-day life, but I felt those pressures, right? So you feel gravity, even before you know what gravity is. And I think now as an adult, and particularly in the work that I do in race and politics education, what I've been able to learn is how different identities and different demographics literally impact the way that you live your life, right? So there are gonna be ways that people interact, differently with me and Derek, even just on the basis of gender. And so there's class, there's gender, there's race. And I think what I've been able to see even more as an adult, understanding like the historical reasons why certain groups face certain oppressions and things like that has helped me understand the things that I already experience in the day-to-day. So one example of that really practically, which if you've done any race education you know of, is the stereotype of the angry black woman, right? So, a black woman can just state a matter of fact or how she's feeling or say the same thing as a white man next to her, and it's already immediately perceived as angry. And so I think I take that into account in the work that I do and how I interact with people, that understanding that the particulars of the body that I'm in, right, which is cis woman, black, young, able-bodied, that all of those particularities affect all the interactions that I have with people in the world, and it affects the material conditions of the life that I live, the resources that I have access to, the extent to which I'm in danger or not. And so definitely being a black woman has completely shaped my worldview of the world, and I think it also fully impacts how others around me interact with me.
Right. So I'm wondering, for both of you, how does activism or non-activism play a role because of the way that people perceive you or act towards you? Because you're both content creators. You both have different reasons or motivations for being in a public arena.
Yep.
So what would you, Derek, what is your purpose as a content creator, if not activism, as a black man? What is your purpose in general?
Honestly, my purpose is like memes.
Okay.
Like, just to be honest. Yeah. Like, serious. It sounds silly, right? It sounds silly, but from what I've been seeing, and because I started my channel as like tongue-in-cheek, and I wasn't being extremely serious, but then when I started seeing certain issues that were annoying me, and I just thought, hey, I think people should just be a little bit more cordial, more chill. Let's just have some fun. There's a lot of issues that we can talk about, but we don't need to be at each other's throats. Mm-hmm. So my thing was just to try to, extend the olive branch or whatever,
right.
and certain things that bother me, I will come at it. So if somebody's being hostile, I'll be hostile towards them. But I'm not an activist, and I respect activism, but just there's certain things that like I feel like I can reach a lot of people by just having a good time and having people come together, because some of the people that I revere the most are all about unity. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that brings us together is like laughter, just having fun. So I'm always trying to like reach that, you know what I mean?
If I may follow it up with a question, Marissa, before we move on. I'm curious, if you're not an activist, but you're on stage here to talk about blackness and black justice and things of that nature, what can your form of entertainment or content bring to the table in terms of conveying to the audience or people who are listening your perspective and bringing that bridging that gap, I suppose? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I see it as in a way, like, say, one of my favorite people is the late George Carlin, and that guy, great guy. And what he did was he interjected. He talked about a lot of serious stuff, but under the guise of his stand-up.
Yes.
And I love that. And so it's one of those things where I'm indirectly kind of, some people might consider me an activist to a certain extent, but that's not the point of, I'm just trying to give my 2 cents, maybe think a little, or get people to think a little bit more critically. But I think a lot of times you can soften people up with comedy and just show that, like, oh, he's a chill guy, which I'm just some guy, like I'm some black guy, right? Like that's kind of why I even say that. Like I'm no one special, and everybody, especially since it's YouTube, everybody can do like the same thing if they want to. And you always see extremely talented people coming up, and then they're giving their 2 cents, and a lot of times they're saying things that are way more interesting than I ever could. And it's awesome. I like it.
I like
Good
it.
time.
Too. Yeah. Marissa, activism?
Yeah, so I guess I'm definitely an activist. I guess you would say dabbled in that world a little bit. So like I said, I grew up with really conservative religious parents, right? And so, and I also grew up at a time, and a lot of other black folks around my age will say the same thing. Like, we went to school in a time where we were taught that the KKK was a thing of the past and would never return, right? That like Nazis were like universally bad. When I came up in school, like that wasn't a controversy. It was like saying Nazis are bad was I'm shocked that it's controversial in 2018. And so growing up in that context, I didn't really have an awareness about about how racism and white supremacy was functioning in my life. And I think that that's true for a lot of people of black folks of my same age and everything. And a big turning point for a lot of us was obviously the murder of Trayvon Martin and then the murder of Mike Brown, which sort of set off what we call the Ferguson Rebellion that most people know of. And so that was my entry point into activism. And I think, reflecting back, I think what first pulled me into that work was really the need for community and a need for space to grieve what I was feeling as a black person, what a lot of black people were feeling, which is this sense of helplessness and that everything that we had been told was a lie. And so that's how I first got into activism and doing this work, and why it's continued to be sustained for me is because, well, one, I'm on my own path and journey of learning, right? My politics have progressed. And also because I think that I have something of value to offer to conversations to push them forward and to push us in directions that are safer for people. Because the reality of the fact is that a lot of people try to treat these hot button issues, including racism and white supremacy, as though they're just like fun topics to debate, like which flavor of ice cream is better, vanilla or chocolate, right? But these issues that we're talking about are not mundane because they have actual consequences on the lives of real humans, right? Like some people are going to die because of some of the ways that very powerful people think and because they act on those ideas. And so for me, there's definitely a sense of urgency around the communities that I represent and the notion that some of my people will not survive the things that are happening now. And so there's definitely a sense of urgency for me to advance the political conversation and to do political education in such a way that will hopefully reduce harm towards black folks and that will reduce white supremacy in the world. And that's a skill set also that I naturally have. So one of the things that I focus in my activism, one is agitation work. And so if you look at any of my work, it's always about sort of stirring up the pot in an effort to move things further left, right? So like even the shutdown of Bernie Sanders, in the presidential election, there were so many things that happened that moved what was considered center further right. And I feel like our action, especially as controversial as it was one of the few things that moved the conversation further left, right? Democratic candidates had to respond and take a more leftist position on criminal justice reform, and even Republican candidates had to respond. And so my work is less so about getting people to believe exactly the same things that I believe, but more how can I push a conversation further left? How can I advance Black liberation in that way? Mm-hmm. And part of the way that I do it through the content that I create right now is taking these really big, ethereal, difficult concepts like mass incarceration or police brutality or white supremacy and helping people boil them down to like, okay, that's cool that you watched 13th and cried about it, but what does that actually mean for you and your life, and what are the tangible steps that you could take today, no excuses, to change the world that we live in for the people who live here now and also the future. So where a lot of race education is like the idea that if we just learn more and have different ideas that will automatically change things, the work that I do takes it a step further and actually coaches people through taking pragmatic steps to end white supremacy.
I love it. So
Yep.
you're more fun and casual, a little bit softer maybe for some people to digest. And in what ways do you think your content can help bridge that divide in a world that is so polarized? YouTube is extremely, especially for those of us who live on it, very polarized.
Sure.
And sometimes it's very easy to feel alienated, you know? And I want to bridge these two ideas because I think it's possible in a way that could be constructive. And I wondered, while she was talking, did anything inspire you, or you thought, oh, my content could help with that?
I don't know that necessarily, but it did like spark like conversations to be had.
Please,
absolutely. Well, like one of the first things that stood out to me was when you're saying that people were debating or that the fact that whether Nazis are bad or not, and that's something like, say, me personally, I haven't met anybody other than people who hold those ideals that don't think it's bad. I don't know where that comes from. I've genuinely, say, talking to people that, universally, we know through media and everywhere, yeah, it's terrible. Fascism, the way that things went down, the way the World War II went down, it's really bad. And certain kids and people that lived in their basements and now they have a platform online, we don't like it. But at the same time, a lot of those kids can be talked to and tell them like, hey, this is silly. Like, why do you believe this stuff? And they can easily just renounce that stuff. It happens. There's people that talk to these people, reach out to them. They don't badger them and beat them over the head and try to act like they're monsters, because that kind of fortifies their position. Now they just want to stay like this. And now they're like, oh, this is how these people are going to treat me. And I feel isolated, and I'm going to find other people like me. And I think it makes bigger issues. And so I like talking to people that I disagree with. I try to be cordial with them too. And sometimes I've had people that had prejudice against me. Like, I once dated this girl that, his dad was like some trucker guy from the South. And we had a few conversations. And he came up to me one time as like kind of condescending it was, but at the same time, he's like, you really changed my mind about a lot of things indirectly. Just like talking to the guy and him having this perception of how black people are because what he sees on TV and the media. And that was like another thing, like talking about like, say, police brutality or excessive force, something that a long time ago, back in 2010, 2011, I used to talk about because there were some big issues. But to me, I wanted to focus on that and less about race, because when we talk about, like, say, Trayvon Martin and other people, like, the media highlights that, and only those cases, but they don't talk about other people. Like, say, in my neighborhood, I grew up in a Hispanic neighborhood, and stuff happens all the time. Never any media coverage. One of the biggest things that got me into, like, paying attention to excessive force was Kelly Thomas. He got beaten to death in, like, just a few miles from me. It was just this white dude, got beaten by 2 Hispanic cops or whatever. Well, one of them was, at least. And they got acquitted, and people were mad, but then the media's kind of like, oh, they're not black, who cares? You know what I'm saying? And what I don't like about that is it gives this perception in the black community that we're constantly in danger. Like, and I tell people that you can try to be safe. I've lived everywhere. I've lived smack down in the middle of South Central Los Angeles. I was okay. I was fine. Like, where the windows are barred up, have my house broken into by people just stealing stuff. They're trying to do their thing. Cops coming by. I never got harassed or anything like that. I never tried to put myself in danger. I never did anything stupid. Sometimes I would see people trying to start trouble. You know what I'm saying? Like, everybody there is a Laker fan for the most part, and then people are wearing Celtics jerseys trying to start stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like, that kind of stuff where I'm like, hey, let's think about this for a second. And that's kind of where I come in. I know I'm getting like a little bit, off into a little thing. But my point is that I think when people kind of just use a little bit of critical thinking and also realize that, like, media manipulation, to me, is a big issue, because we can talk about, like, certain problems that people face in the United States, and I think that it transcends to a lot of other people, not just the black community. But one thing I want black Americans to do, I want them to feel like they are free. I want them to realize that they do have the opportunity to do almost anything they want, and they have a lot of readily available resources, like me, like my brother, who has his master's, who's a statistician. He's doing great, but he leans a lot more on the political spectrum with you, but he's also doing very well for himself. You know what I'm saying? And I want people to feel like they can do that. They can study hard and possibly be, the president if they wanted to be, like, say, Obama. Like, it is possible if they want to be like an astronaut. Transcend sky. Sky's not the limit anymore. Like, it can be done, and we tell the youth that this can be done, and things like systemic racism, little pockets that are around, you need to rise above it and not let it be a hindrance, and not let it cripple you and think that the game is rigged, so why even try? And that's kind of like where I'm at.
Did you want to retort, or would you? Okay, please.
Yeah, so obviously I acknowledge that I occupy a very different space because I am actually an activist, and I do work in communities that are organizing on the ground, and I also do deal with mainstream media a lot.
Yeah.
They don't like me. Spoiler alert. But I mean, I guess to respond to what you said on a couple of grounds. So one is the idea, which is very mainstream, which is like, if you just like kind of like ease people along, you bring them along with sugar, and you like reach out a hand and be kind to them, that you will change their beliefs in such a way that they'll stop oppressing people. And historically, like, that hasn't been the way that revolutions have happened, or that certain oppressive regimes have been overcome. So a really classic example of that here in the United States is obviously chattel slavery, right? There was not this great meeting of like people sitting down and like, let me convince you that slavery is really bad. And then slave owners are like, you know what? You really convinced me. I think I'm going to free all the people that I'm enslaving. There were violent revolts, and that there were material consequences to upholding chattel slavery in that way. So we're going to burn down your entire plantation, and we're going to kill all of the family members who live in the house. And after you have a certain number of revolts, then some of the tide starts to change. And so that's the interesting thing about race and racism, is it feels a lot better to believe that we can just kind of that we can give people enough reasons to do the right thing. But what we actually see in a lot of ways, what's more effective, is to make the consequences of upholding oppressive systems so great that people leave it in their own self-interest. And so the things that are more effective in getting people to end white supremacy or stop being racist or whatever is actually making it really culturally and socially taboo to be racist, to be white supremacist, or to levy material consequences for people for doing that. So say, for instance, a company does something really like racist and fucked up or whatever, you can encourage that company to try to get them to do the right thing, right? Or you can boycott them or affect their sales, and they're gonna do the right thing immediately. So that's kind of the realm that I work in. But I think it's really interesting that you bring up this idea that acknowledging the reality of the world that we live in terms of race and white supremacy is somehow us becoming powerless. Because I think that that's a huge myth, that acknowledging some of these systems that we face leaves us powerless. And for the work that I do, it's actually really empowering, because like I said, from how I grew up, Black people are already facing these sort of pressures that are like gravity, right? We can't necessarily see them, but they're pushing in on us. And for me, it's really empowering to understand why that thing is happening to me, why this person is treating me this way, and to understand the history behind how it works, so you can see, oh, actually there is a path to fight back to end these particular things. Because, you know, just like you said, where you're like, people can, sort of this idea that you can transcend race, you know, we've seen it, and it's true. You can't degree your way out of racism. You can't money your way out of racism, right? Like, you can be Oprah and still get followed in a store, right? Because people think you're going to steal something. You can be you can have a PhD, and people are still going to think that you're breaking into a home that's your own home, right? So there's this way that race functions that, unfortunately, there's no other out for us that we can buy through different ways. And so for me, and the work that I do in terms of educating about race and politics, and specifically the work that I do with other Black folks, is empowerment of saying, you're not crazy. The thing that you're feeling, that everybody's telling you, like, oh, that's not really happening, like, oh, are you sure that's just you? You're not crazy. There's actually a historical reason for why you are experiencing the things that you're experiencing, because all of us inherited the legacy of colonialism and white supremacy in the United States. We're all still living by certain scripts that were set for us hundreds of years ago and that have been passed down. And so for me, it's very empowering with the communities I work through to go back and actually be able to put a name to the things that we're experiencing, and then to say, now that I've identified this thing with specificity, now we know how we can take control over our own lives to actually fight back against the oppressive forces that we are experiencing. And I think, you know, in the communities that I work with on the ground with organizers, you know, when you talk about other communities being affected, there's some really great solidarity work that goes on. So I'm from Seattle, Washington, and the indigenous population has really huge issues with police there, right? That they murder indigenous folks at high rates. And so in terms of the activism and the organizing, there's already connections between Latinx folks and Black folks. There's already cross-solidarity between indigenous folks and Black folks. So these groups are already sort of working together, and I think people don't realize that, and if they're not in those communities, and like you said, in particular, if the media is putting a particular spin on things. So I think that the situation on the ground is a lot more complex than most people realize, but I would just highlight and say that there is solidarity work, that different groups are working together. That's why when the the Ferguson rebellion first popped off, there were groups of black activists from Ferguson going to Palestine, right? And Palestinians like giving tips and tricks to people who were like uprising in Baltimore and things like that. You know, when the umbrella protests were happening in China, there was cross solidarity there. So there's work that's happening there. And for the black folks that I work with and the groups that I work with, it's actually very empowering to finally and accurately name the oppressive forces that we're dealing with and saying we're going to fight back.
Yeah, when it comes to that, like that's where like we just differ quite a bit, because as far as like seeing oppressive forces, and I noticed like you say the black and you call them Latinx community working together, and then it sounds like, you know, any white communities or anything else are kind of excluded, and because they're probably oppressive forces, and I don't see the world that way. I don't see the way things will work and the way I've experienced life and the way where I've lived everywhere and lived overseas and stuff. And like, I don't feel that. And the thing is, I know there's people that do feel certain things, but I also feel like they've been, you know, for lack of a better term, indoctrinated to feel a certain way because well, what I'm trying to say is that when we're young, we're blank slates, we're like empty vessels, and then we have choices, our parents have choices to, you know, educate us in a certain way. And I feel like the way that their parents perceive the world is the way that, you know, the kids are gonna grow up, and that's how they're gonna see things. And my mom kind of let me like figure things out for the most part and experience the world, and I didn't really, like the racism that I experienced was so mild and usually not from white people. It's usually from like just discriminatory because I just grew up in a Hispanic community, so I didn't know very many black people. And when they would come around, they would say like a lot of BS to me, you know, because like, oh, you're so different. Like, why are you trying to act a certain way? I'm like, I'm just living my life. And so even though when I moved back to LA, just being surrounded in like the community and stuff, and I was an adult and that changed and stuff. And it's like, I started to realize like a lot of that anger and angst was what a lot of people were feeling, and they're confused. And I feel like, say, once you start talking and you're being like just chill, and there's a sense of community within like just people in general, and we can talk to like, say, doesn't matter what race you are, we can figure things out. I mean, even when like, say, all the way back to where I bought a car from this one guy, this white dude, and he was in the Vietnam War, and one of his black friends got excluded from a club, and he was furious. And he was just, because he didn't grow up in that like, say, prejudiced society where it's like, oh, it's us against them and stuff like that, and he didn't understand. And he wanted to understand why certain people, like why certain white folk act a certain way, or why certain black folk act a certain way, why is this all this heat and this debate, why is everything so combative? And I told him, like, that's kind of what my channel's about, where I want people to be chill. And it's cool finding other people like that too. And my whole point is like, say, I understand how you're saying that people are feeling empowered, like they're finding one another and say they're finding tools to fight back, but like, in my opinion, like this isn't a war, this isn't a fight. Like this isn't like, we want to, like, I think we do a better job. I honestly think we do a better job coming together. And I think where there are wars and fights, like actual proxy wars, actual fights, actual death, actual like regimes being toppled, and then slavery being reintroduced, and you know, Africans being enslaved, where I have no idea what any of that stuff feels like. I have no perception of any of that stuff. Where there's like, in my opinion, what oppression is, because I can't, for myself, like I can't say the way that I grew up and the way that I live in the United States, where I have this awesome phone, car, house, you know, resources everywhere. I can go to the library and use the internet. There's Wi-Fi everywhere at Starbucks. Like, I don't know what the hell oppression is. Like, I don't know what that is. I know you have a lot to say about that, but that's like where like I'm so like in a different world that I feel like just the way that I try to see outside my own social bubble and look on the outside and see what else is going on in the world and what's going on with other people. And I feel, it makes me feel silly when I feel like, say, when I'm inconvenienced and I kind of consider that oppression, because I don't feel it. I really don't. And sometimes I feel like we do a disservice to people, like my grandpa that died last year, rest in peace. Like, he was like talking a lot of trash on the black youth and saying like, you kids have no idea the type of shit I had to go through. Like, what is your problem? Like, you have everything at your fingertips, and what are you complaining about? And that was one of those things where I was younger and I didn't really, like, what are you talking about, dude? Like, I'm a kid. I don't even know what he's talking about. But as I got older, I totally understood what he was saying, because the stuff he had to go through, obviously, everything, the riots, everything that he went through back in the 60s, and then some. It was just massive amounts of racism, segregation. Everybody hated each other's guts. And now we're at the point where we kind of jumping these hurdles, right? Trying to get over this and move forward. But I feel like what's happening now, because like everybody's identifying, like say, oh, these people are the white supremacists, the systemic racism and everything. And now a lot of other people, a lot of good people in this crowd right here that are just white. They happen to be oppressors. They're racist because they were born a certain way. And then it just more division is created. And it's like, I don't feel like it's solving anything. Just from in the way that I do things and the way that I've seen things. This is my opinion. I'm not speaking for everybody, but I'm speaking on that, like, I know these people aren't terrible people. I know they don't want to oppress me. I know they don't want to like steal from me. They don't want to keep me down. Maybe some people in here might have a perception of, oh, poor black person, you're black, so therefore you are oppressed and you need a platform, you need to be uplifted or something, like I'm some infant. But you know what I'm saying? There might be a couple people in there, but I just say, I'm fine, I'm all right. I really want people to believe that I'm okay and realize that I'm doing well for myself and I'm enjoying life. And I want, like, my thing is, and I'm hoping that like other people that you talk to is ask them, like, how are you? Are you living well? And if they are, like, that's a great step, and hopefully people aren't like, oh, it's so dreadful, everything's so bad, what am I gonna do? I'm shaking in my boots, like, well, I don't know, maybe we can fix that. I'm just saying.
May I ask a question really fast? You
but-
said it's slight inconvenience and then oppression. Can you give me an example of what a slight inconvenience might look like where someone might think it's oppression? It sounded like you might have an example in mind.
Yeah, a lot of times, okay, so, I've working class guy, I've applied for hundreds and hundreds of jobs, especially sometimes when there's a recession or whatever, and where I know people that would cry oppression, saying I'm not getting this job because of this, or I say I know the market is saturated and it's very inconvenient to do this, but you got to keep trying. Sometimes you have to go to a job agency and unload some trucks, where I had to unload 600 grandfather clocks in 8 hours. Got to make money. And I'm that person where I was like learning from being in the Hispanic community, like they just shut up and work. Like they come over and they're like, I'm just gonna do my job. And that's what they do. And they're not saying I'm oppressed or whatever. Some people are, some of the younger ones are like, but like some of the younger people are like, oh, I'm like, this is the worst thing ever. I'm coming over here and I don't have this and I don't have that. While like the older generations usually just keeping their heads down, humble, working hard. And I'm like the same thing. Like it's inconvenient. It really is. I wish that things get handed to me. It'd be awesome. But that's not how things work. And so I don't call that oppression. I call it just like an inconvenience. And one thing that we're taught from like when we're kids is that life isn't fair. I wish it was. I wish everything was fair. But, I'm like, we just work around it. We work around it. We get things done. And I'm so grateful that I don't live in like a third world country, right? Sure. Where I don't have access to water, Like, there's people that don't have access to water that have to walk miles to get dirty water and hopefully boil it, and hopefully they don't die from malaria and stuff. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I'm just saying, like, I think I can deal with some minor inconveniences, and I feel like some people are legitimately oppressed, but that's just how I see the definition,
Well,
but,
and the gag is especially when you talk about unclean water in third world countries, there's black
folks. You're talking
folks.
about Flint, right?
Well, not just.
I'm not sure why that was funny, but
Yeah,
I don't either.
I'm talking about Flint. I'm talking about Detroit. I'm talking about places all over the United States, including across the South. So there are those issues here. It's interesting that you talk about indoctrination because the viewpoints that you've expressed are actually not. They're actually the status quo of the indoctrination that Black folks are given in school systems and things like that is to believe that like we're in this post-racial society, right? So I guess my perspective would be that this idea that like, yes, we know all of this historical context, but just don't worry about that. You can do anything you want. And this idea of like sort of hiding your eyes to the material realities is the way that we sort of transcend race. That's actually a form of indoctrination, So even like the example that you give of applying for jobs and things like that. You can say like, I don't feel like race had anything to do with that, and you're entitled to feel that way, and yet there's also like studies and data on studies that they've done where they literally give resumes with certain names or certain pictures, and
Sure.
that employers will. So there's like
It happens.
Right.
Discrimination does
So what I'm
happen.
saying is that there's like a statistical reality behind what you're saying. And if I could finish my point,
Sure.
what's interesting. And this is why I have a lot of latitude for Black folks wherever we are sort of in our self-discovery, is one of the things that we end up having to, like every Black person is at a different place in their understanding of self and their place in this world and their understanding of like what their Blackness means to them. I'm sure you've gone through a progression where you believe, most Black people I know have gone through a progression where they believe different things about that at different times or whatever. And one of the things that I often find when people are sort of trying to explain away the data, right, or basically say like these historical and material realities don't matter, is one of the things that we do is we're like trapped in this system and coming up with scenarios, basically putting all the data aside and coming up with scenarios that don't fit the data, but that say that we're in control of our lives feels very empowering in the moment, even if we don't actually have control. And so what we'll do is we'll do victim blaming for ourselves and for other Black folks. This happens across gender as well, because I'm gonna tell you that the reason that you're suffering is just because of you and not all of these other conditions around you, because then it makes me feel like if I do all the right things that I have control in my life, when really there's a lot of scenarios and a lot of spaces where there are these outside forces acting on us. So like even if you're talking about the, jobs or whatever, it's really empowering to believe, even against the data, that race has nothing to do with this, and when they see my picture, it won't make any difference. But you feeling that way won't change the fact that statistically and historically, when someone sees your picture, when you walk into the interview room, no matter what you say or whatever, when they read your name, if you have a Black name or whatever, that's gonna impact how you're interacting. And the interesting thing that I find about oppression and white supremacy that I think people get really confused is this idea that if we just like bring everybody together, that will solve it. And I think that shows that people really don't have even a cursory understanding of what the issues are, because how white supremacy functions, particularly in the United States, the best thing that it's comparable to is like a form of domestic violence and intimate violence, right? Where there is like incredible violence that happens to people who are extremely close to each other who might even live in the same spot. So a great example of this is like the plantation home, right? You can literally be own Black people as slaves, but still have them come and live in your home, have them breastfeeding your children. And so there's this idea that violence happens and it's only under separation, but a lot of violence actually is incredibly intimate. You can be violent towards people who live in your home, right? Who are your children, who are your spouses, who are your family members. And so you have to understand that like just putting everybody together doesn't solve this, because it's not addressing like the cycles of violence that are actually happening. And so it's why, if you do any historical study on racism and how it functions in the United States, one good thing to do is to go back and read the narratives of slave owners, right? And how they described themselves as slave owners and how they describe their slaves. And if you read from them, they don't think they're bad people. They think they're good people. They think they're doing right by their slaves. They'll even say that they love the people that they're enslaving, which most of us would argue that that's bad, right? And so there's this way that some of the worst violence that we experience, which most of us know because a lot of us have been in spaces where we've experienced intimate partner violence or domestic violence, there's this way that violence is actually incredibly intimate, right? In some ways, if we were able to separate from people, we might be safer. And so largely in this conversation, what I think is missing is this idea that like we don't have to actually engage with any of the historical realities. And I guess that's the different world that I live in. Teaching race on a national scale is saying that we actually have to be knowledgeable about the actual material impacts of the politics that are happening now and historically how they've happened, to understand how we get from like chattel slavery to mass incarceration. Mm-hmm. And that simply like wishing that those things don't matter doesn't actually change
I don't know
change
who's
those
doing
facts.
that, but it's not me.
May I ask a question?
It's not just wishing.
Here we are, we have this reality where life isn't fair. We all agree, life isn't fair.
Of course.
And we all have struggles, personal struggles, intimate struggles. And my curiosity is, we have people on stage who are focused on Black lives, Through BLM, I learned about white people being also discriminated against. Police brutality is not, black people have focused on black people because they are black people. So my question is it so wrong for our identities to be the form of justice that we're using as our motivator? Like, is it wrong that she focuses on black lives? Is it wrong that I focus on queer lives? Is it wrong that you focus on everybody? Can't we bring these ideas all together and then, create a consensus?
I mean, I don't necessarily see anything wrong with it. Like,
Okay.
if that's what you want to do, like,
Yeah.
I just question whether what you're doing, your activism, is it doing more harm than good?
Sure.
A lot of times that happens.
If I may, how do you, as a non-activist, feel you have a place to speak on the actions of activism if you aren't in root activism work? Like, if you don't understand activism, how can you know? Because don't you think
Well,
it
it's
might
not
look
that
foreign?
it's not that I don't understand activism. Actually,
Okay.
a few years back, say about 8 years ago, it wasn't like I wasn't a race or identity, like a racial identity activist. But
Got it.
I would talk a lot about secularism, atheism, and when I discovered like that realm on YouTube and the
Yeah.
Four Horsemen and everything, and I was like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And so for a while, I was really like just entrenched in that stuff, and I was learning a lot of stuff, and also learning, like, say, when I talk about indoctrination, like, that's a big thing. We start off empty, and then we usually get filled with stuff, and that depends on usually how we grow up, and then it's really hard to break that mold. And so since I grew up, like I said, since the way that I grew up was pretty, tame for the most part, certain things I experienced and not jump into conclusions because no one's telling me that it's specifically because I'm black. I'm able to try to think rationally about it. And something I just wanted to hop back to some stuff
Please.
that you said before, because you're talking about history and you're also talking about like statistics and studies and stuff. And like a lot of things that I read, like unfortunately sometimes the statistics are made to fit a narrative. It happens a lot. A lot of times you need to say who's doing it, who's funding it, and see this is the conclusion that they're always going to come out to. They're going to find that conclusion because they want to prove this. And then they exclude everything else where it's like, oh, there are issues, absolutely, but that's not everything. And so don't look at this statistic and be like, oh, so anytime I apply for a job, I'm going to be discriminated against because I'm black. And it happens. That's what people, like, this type of stuff gets people riled up. And instead of like, well, let's try to examine it. Maybe if you think you are being discriminated against, like, you can take action, try to see if things are going on. Or maybe you could try to go somewhere else and try to take a better path, which other people do. I mean, it's just something that, like, that's one of the things when it comes to statistics is even with transcending just like statistics on that, statistics on feminism and other cases and stuff. Like, we've seen, a lot of people in the crowd know, they've seen statistics that are just like, oh, this isn't completely accurate. Other people are looking at these things. And I feel like a lot of times that there's an issue that doesn't get discussed, where it's like, I think we need better numbers, larger numbers, more studies and stuff, and like, it happens, but something that, like, we didn't talk about, or I haven't mentioned, because you're talking about, like, say, waiving history. Like, I think history is very important. History is one of my favorite subjects. Like, I love talking about it, and one thing, though, I just noticed, though, especially when it comes to, like, the black community, when we talk about history, it's something that is, like, completely, like, the claws are just in them, digging them, it's something that they can't escape. And I talked to other cultures. I talked to Japanese Americans, my French teacher, who was a kid in the internment camps. And she tells me stuff, and like, oh, my parents suffered greatly, and luckily I was a kid, I didn't understand what was going on. They actually did get checks, right, for it. They're like, oh, sorry for your suffering, and she didn't spend it, she still has it. She's like, I don't feel like I earned this money. I didn't go through this stuff. I didn't suffer like they did. I was a kid. I was very lucky that I didn't have to go through what they went through. And so my whole thing is that, like, that I love that perception. I love learning about, like, say, you talk about oppression everywhere. You can talk about, say, the Roman Empire oppressing the Celts and genociding them. And I don't hear Celtic people talking about this all the time. I don't hear Irish people in America always talking about how, oh, we endangered servitude, or like Italian Americans were considered less than, like, they were all like all these waves of people, and it's like we've gotten over it. Japanese Americans getting over it. It's not being thrown in the face all the time.
Well, there's reasons for that, right? So even like,
well, what's the reason?
Example, like for the example that you gave for Irish people, right? There
Sure.
was a time where Irish people in the United States were not considered white. Right? And that shifted. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, there are like actual historical reasons.
Yeah,
I don't
but-
know how many times but like there are actually like historical like reasons for all of these things. And it's interesting, racism is like one of the only issues where people say that like knowing less will somehow help us solve the problem, right? So I used this example last night when I was talking to someone where it's like, if something goes wrong with your car, right? You don't say, fuck, I need to know less about how this engine works in order to solve the problem, right? Like there's no issue.
I'm curious who says that about racism though.
No, but the idea, here's what I'm saying is with racism, like the idea that like learning about the particularities of history or even assigning like this is what's happening in this scenario will somehow help us solve the problem.
That's the Q&A.
Jesus.
They're running to the Q&A.
That is a lot of people.
Hold on.
bit.
Let Marissa finish. Let Marissa finish. Hold on.
All right, that's it, guys. Later.
Hold on. One last. Go ahead. Hold on.
Okay. Let her finish the point.
Yeah, so I guess it's just the work that I do in the space that I occupy. Like you said, you conceded that, some of the ways that even in a job interview where maybe what you're experiencing is racism, but you also said maybe it is, right? The work that I do is for the people who maybe it is, right?
Yeah, but you're kind of fortifying that it is though.
Let me say, so I work in the space where we can like actually talk about those realities, and some of the reasons why they're so harsh is because the reality of the world that we live in is like actually harsh, and those oppressive systems and oppressive regimes have never been overcome by like skirting over the issue, which I feel like is part of what's in the conversation happening now. So that's why the work that I do is about talking about issues with specificity and tying them back to like understanding how we got here. Because we didn't get here out of nowhere, right? We got here, like you said, because of things that our parents and our grandparents and people who were alive way before we were ever alive were here. And I think that that's part of the reason why people say, I don't understand why racism is still happening or whatever. There's all these forces happening in our world that people don't understand why they're still happening,
Right.
but they're because we've inherited a legacy that we often don't know about or explore.
And with that, we're going to move to the Q&A. Thank you,
Yeah.
guys. Derek? Or Dimitri?
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. And just a reminder, switch to orange juice at some point during the day.
Yes, good afternoon. I've enjoyed everything that I've heard here from the, I've enjoyed everything that I've heard here from the activist lady to the brother here. I don't know if you're conservative or not. I'm nonpartisan, however, I'm an independent with very conservative views. Now, I heard you speaking, and I have a question. Sessions, when he was appointed by our president, Donald Trump, one of the immediate things that he did was to go in and try to revoke the civil rights bill, okay, and the voting rights. Now, I can be a black Republican, a black conservative, but if these rights are revoked, then I would be, if those rights are reversed, I'd just be a black Republican in back of the bus, maybe talking white. Now, for you, young lady, and I will let you answer that question, for you, everything doesn't need to be a battle. Some things is just finesse. You know, you just finesse your way through it, and you just, you enjoy the benefits like this gentleman was talking about. I believe most black people are capitalists. If you go down the streets of the ghetto, you'll see guys with socks in their hands. You'll see guys selling barrettes. I mean, what society is called now a side hustle has always been a hustle in the black community because most black people are capitalists. Now we
got to get to the question. There's a ton of people.
Okay, the question is to you. I'm sorry, people. The question is to you that do you think everything needs to be gone after physically, going after as an attack, or just some compromising and the deal will be made? I got two questions there.
I can start with that. If you want me to start with that.
Go with your question, and then we'll go to Marissa.
Yeah, with the judge
Okay.
session.
Well, I didn't necessarily get a question. I was just
There
a
was.
comment.
I asked
But
you
the
how
question
you
that at the end, just want us both our take on it.
the feel about Judge Sessions.
He asked you
Sessions.
about Sessions
He asked you about
and
Sessions.
the Voter Rights Act.
Because
Like-
you have Republicans being nominated through Trump,
Yeah.
who are trying to reverse the civil rights work that people have
So
done.
what I think about that, or
Yeah, how do you justify sort of not acknowledging that racism still exists while racism is in the White House.
Yeah.
Because if those are affected, then if they are revoked, you will be affected.
Yeah,
and me and you both are probably capitalists. I got a dump truck out there that
Guys,
costs me about
we can't. We
$175,000.
gotta. It's just you gotta.
Thank you.
One question. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
All right, it's real quick. Like, if there's any perception from anybody that thinks racism doesn't exist, or if anybody ever says that, they're obviously, that can't be the case of what they actually believe. That's silly. That's really silly. So, yeah, there was even a white nationalist. Yeah, there's people that are trying to I want to join the RNC, and they're like, get out of here. Yeah, the people, it still exists. Stupid stuff like that's gonna happen, and we just stay vigilant to combat it. It's as simple as that. It's as simple as that.
And then Marissa,
Do you want me to answer the other question?
Dimitri, do you want us to move?
Do you want me to
one
answer that?
question?
Real quick.
Yeah, I can answer it really quickly. I think it's really good that I started off the day talking about the stereotype of the angry black woman, because you'll notice I've been sitting here in my cute little my cute little white dress or whatever, and I'm talking in a very calm,
Absolutely,
but
yeah.
specific tone about things that I've studied extensively and worked at high levels on, and yet the perception is that I'm angry or that there's claws or whatever when I'm sitting here with my boots crossed,
I
right?
mean, I don't think anybody has that
The
perception.
crowd is disagreeing.
Do you think activism is automatically
So I'm
seen?
responding to his question, his question, which is, do you think everything has to be so much of a fight? And what I'm saying is that white supremacy is so ingrained as an American value that even just calmly talking about the issues is perceived as aggressive or a fight, when in my opinion, it's just talking about the issues as it is. So that's how I would respond to that question.
All right. Firstly, I just want to thank you both, or all three of you, for a very intellectual presentation of some very powerful ideas. I have two quick questions. One for Marissa. One.
Can you guys talk
You can only
louder?
get one,
I'm deaf.
unfortunately.
Okay. All right. In that case, I'll try to condense them into one. So, on one hand, you have the more individualist view, which is that if people are to live together in a society of different ethnicities and all kinds of different collective identities, then they have to, on some level, see themselves as individuals so they can interact with each other in that way. On the other hand, you have the issue, say you have 10 black individuals, one of them succeeds and the other 9 pretty much stay where they are, because that's just statistically kind of like a rough approximation of black America. If you focus on the one, then you are, in a sense, actually reducing the power of the remaining of 9 to actually change their stance insofar as it requires collective action. So the question is, what do you see as that balance between the individualism necessary for people to get along and is there a place for collective identity to undo, let's say, history of systemic oppression or something like that?
Marissa,
You want to go first?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. We talked about this a little bit last night. So that's part of the reason why I talk about systems is I think you need to talk about systems and individuals, right? Because it's a chicken and an egg both thing, right? Societies and systems are made up of a bunch of individuals, right? Who are also impacted by what the collective is doing. So a great example of this is taxes, right? Most of us, we all pay our taxes, right? But if all of us decided one day, fuck it, we're not gonna pay our taxes, and we could agree to all do that as a collective, the whole country, the government wouldn't be able to do anything about it, right? But it's too much of a risk for any individual to say, I'm not gonna pay my taxes, right? So there's this way that we're influenced by what everybody else is doing, and also that all of us as individuals moving like a school of fish change society and make up systems, right? If you don't have a bunch of worker bees who are contributing to the system, you don't have people participating in it. And so that's part of the reason why my work talks about systems like I've done here today, but also, like I said, in the practical work that I do with people who are committed to wanting to end white supremacy and racism, is I walk them through what they, as an individual, how they fit into the issues and how they can actually change it. So I work in both of the realms because I think they both influence each other.
I love it. Derek?
Yeah, just real quick, talking about the collective, a collective community. I don't think there's anything wrong with a community that can get a lot of things done. There's a lot of activism within the community that can really show a lot of change within them. And I actually do encourage that when living in certain areas where if the parents cared more about what was actually going on in the surrounding areas, but I also like recognize that there's sparks of just the individual that can really just take hold, that can, talk to Congress or Senator, whatever, get things done. So I tell people just, recognize that you're an individual and you do have a lot of power and you can get a lot of things done and it can inspire a lot of people to do a lot of great things.
Moving forward, maybe we can have people ask a question to one person so we can get more people up.
So I appreciate that, this is the question too, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Marissa.
I appreciate that you spend a lot of time educating yourself and working with statistics and working with studies and trying to bring this education to people. So my question to you is, statistically speaking, African Americans kill each other more often than any other race in the United States. Why is there a focus, if Black Lives Matter, why is there a focus on the racist aspect when the larger problem is black on black crime?
Go ahead.
So there actually isn't. So if you're a part of Black communities, then you know that this is actually a conversation that Black folks have a lot. And it's not just that there's a higher rate of black on black crime, but there's also a higher rate on white crime. Because statistically speaking, how crime happens, how violent crime happens is gonna happen in the neighborhood with the people that you live around the most, and most places are segregated. So people like to trot the black on black crime, that's like the first thing you go to is to talk about black on black crime, to talk about a reason why we shouldn't talk about racism, but those things are also true in white communities, and it's not a reason to not talk about classism or murder or anything like that. And so I think those are conversations that Black folks are having, particularly like places in like Chicago or whatever. Those are conversations that Black folks are having about how violence happens in their community, and it's very parallel to how violence happens in white communities, because there's actually statistically shown that the violence that happens is gonna be the people that you're around. Those are two issues. They don't negate each other.
Hi there, my name is Adam. This is for Derek. I'm a huge fan of you and your approach to life.
Oh, thanks.
Kind of live kind of approach. White people have made quite a bit of progress since the 1950s from the segregation era and things like that. But there's a growing kind of movement, so to speak, of bigotry and racism coming also from the Black community that I've also experienced myself. Now, I'm a working man just like you. I've worked construction a little bit on the side, and I have been violently attacked for being a white person working on the south side in Section 8 housing in Chicago for simply being white and being there. He tried to kill me with a Corona bottle over my head.
It's a good beer.
Yeah, in high school too, it was similar experiences too, because I went to a high school that had people from Cabrini Greens, which were the housing projects nearby, and they had been attacked for being white. And we have Nation of Islam, for example, which is a Black supremacist organization with Louis Farrakhan that teaches people with lighter skin are inferior because Jacob created them. What can we do to combat this kind of bigotry so that we can come together in terms and be a little bit more respectful of each other? What do you think we can do to improve that situation?
Well, definitely I think the perception in the media, I think that's one of the biggest things because as like what you were saying with the last question, because it is true, like say, a lot of, the same communities are gonna kill each other, black, white, that's gonna happen. But what we see in the media is the perception. We don't talk about that stuff. We talk about the police or white supremacy and then black people are in trouble. That's usually the focus. And so that's the kind of focus. So I feel like media influence, people that are alternative are doing a good job trying to kind of calm people down and tell them that, we're not so different. And somebody that I always kind of look to, this gentleman, Daryl Davis, he has a documentary where he's converted like a bunch of racists, a bunch of KKK members, just by having conversations and befriending them. So just actually talking and understanding one another and realizing that like, why am I mad at you? Why is there any animosity towards each other? Like we are humans after all, you know what I'm saying? Like I want aliens to come down so we can come together as humans. It'll be aliens versus humans. You know what I'm saying? So we can just realize like, why are we fighting with each other? It's silly. It's silly. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so my question is, or just a general thing, is I would like to know your guys' opinion on equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. And like you see different races all coming up to be very successful. You see scientists that are black and white. You see sports stars which are black and white, and like you see different organizations like the NFL. You have a lot of black representation because they're very good athletes, especially in the NBA. So I was just wondering. I mean, as long as you work hard in this country, you can get anything you want. You see people making millions of dollars doing what they love. I don't understand. I think it's just a matter of how hard you work. I'd just like to know you guys'
Who's the question to? You got to pick
You
one.
gotta pick one.
One person.
I'll take her opinion on that.
choice.
Yeah, and what I would say is that is ultimately a myth, right? So if you take a large group of people and you have one person who breaks out of the mold, that's sort of an outlier. So that's a lot of what happens with some of these larger mainstream race conversations is we take a handful of black people who have been given access to certain things, and then we describe them as like they've transcended, right? Like Obama's transcended race. That's why I bring up the example of Oprah, even at the height of her career, super rich, getting followed around in a French store because they think that she's going to steal something, right? So there are these sort of extraordinary cases that aren't representative of what's happening to everybody. And so even, for example, like you bring up sports, like there are a bunch of football players who are making a bunch of money. And so if I just look at those individual like football players that are making quite a bit of money, I might say, oh, there's nothing happening. But then you look at the industry of like the NFL overall, right? Who the owners are majority white, right? Who make way more money than these guys who make a little bit for 3 years and then have a concussion that takes them out of the game forever, right? So that's kind of why I help people step back a little bit to see the larger scheme of things, that just because some individuals might get access in certain ways doesn't negate sort of the whole rest of the story of how the numbers of inequality bear out.
Okay, so this is for Derek. So we kind of touched on it a little bit, like why are we angry at each other? And I don't mean to be offensive or rude to anyone, but how much of that do you think is actually like mental health paranoia on both sides of the spectrum, kind of leading us to fear the other side, or with races, the other race? And how come that's not really spoken about when we talk about this topic of the hurt that black people feel and the connection of slavery, but also the fear that some people have being white in the country today?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That something that we probably should discuss, because that's something that's really important. Especially, you said paranoia and mental health, something, and I'm sure you're aware of in the black community that there's been more of an outreach more than ever, that people are finally starting to talk about like mental health, because it was always a stigma. It's always like, oh, that's like a white thing. You're just sweet. You know what I mean? It would always happen. Like you can't talk about this stuff. Just bottle it up. And I feel like, when we talk about fear and paranoia and like why we hate each other, I feel like if we talk about these things, we talk about our feelings, we talk about issues that people are kind of afraid, or even like say on the white side, that a lot of people are starting to feel afraid to be white because, a few isolated incidents. I think that just having like discussions, a lot of people can't afford therapy, but just talking to people, I think, and then online or whatever, in this room right here, can really just kind of give you that peace of mind, and that I think a lot of people that are kind of they're searching for, and I really believe that. I really believe just having conversations will really kind of have people chill out and maybe share a meme or two. It'll be good.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'll let you know. Don't worry.
Okay. My name is Brian Martinez, Honey Badger Radio. Hey, Derek, what's up? This question is for Marissa. We're very close, yeah. This is it. I have the last question. It's going to be the best one, I promise. It's going to be great. Marissa, I couldn't help but hear some of the language you were using when you were talking about how to address the issues of white supremacy and achieving equality and so on. And it sounds like, and I don't want to misinterpret anything that you're saying, but it sounds like you are calling for something of a revolutionary change and shifting people towards the left, the conversation towards the left. Mm-hmm. And so what I want to know is what would it look like in the U.S. if you accomplished your goals? What would the United States look like? What is your goal ultimately? Also, for Derek, Gauges.
What was that last thing you said? I didn't know the last thing you said.
It's an inside joke.
Gauges?
Gauges. Inside joke, yeah.
It's a YouTube thing. Don't.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll end in that question. We kind of had this conversation a little bit when we were getting ready for the panel talking to speak. Well, one of the things is, the piece about living in community with each other is that whatever the world is going to look like after we make certain changes, that's going to be a collective decision, right? So part of the reason why I won't be able to say, like, this is how it's gonna, you might agree with this, we're always trying to, like, put enforce a system on other people, right? And what I think we all sort of would want is collectively us deciding the real question is how do we want to live together? And that might look something different than what we've ever seen before, right? There was a time when the United States didn't exist. There was a time when capitalism didn't exist. All of these things were sort of invented. And so if you look amongst like Black activists and Black revolutionaries that I work with, all of us are dealing with the problem of white supremacy and trying to answer the question of like, how do we fix this? But people have a wide range of views, and I'm still like progressing in my views. I tend to lean more towards Pan-African socialism right now. But that's just where I am. But acknowledging that like the Black folks are not a monolith, and there's a bunch of different views around that, and there might be some compromises that we decide on when we actually get to the places where we're able to just end the violence that's happening now.
So we got time for one more question, and man, I wish that came up in the debate, but our speakers will be out in the lobby to talk more.
Hi, my name is Lauren. And so when it comes to race, I don't regard it at all, okay? I'm half Black, half white. Does that mean that I'm half oppressed? It's bullshit.
Yes.
It's absolute bullshit, okay? And until we can start dealing with people as individuals, then we're never gonna get anywhere. I don't understand this thinking that you're gonna tell all Black people that all white people hate them and that somehow we're gonna come together and that's gonna bring us together. No, you're out of your mind, okay? It's ridiculous. This is 2018. We don't live in the times of slavery.
Do we have a question?
I don't give a damn if white people hate us.
Yeah. We gotta get to a question.
The question is, how do you expect to bring people together when you are constantly telling Black people that all white people hate them? You don't know what's going on in anyone's mind.
That was our first aggressive question of the evening, of the day. Thank you.
If you would like to hear Marissa's answer, you will be quiet. Go ahead, Marissa.
Yeah, so I never actually said that. And what's interesting is I share a very similar background to the person who just spoke up. My mother is white, my father is Black, and so my views and perspectives don't come from a lack of understanding of those backgrounds or even how white people work. It's more of saying we can either sit here and ignore the elephant in the room, the thing that's operating our lives. We can pretend that the things that are happening aren't happening. That's fine, we can do that. Or we can actually get serious about addressing the things that we are seeing every single day if we want to live in a better world. That's where I work in, that's the people that I work with. I've never told it, like, you can choose as an individual to believe however you want to believe, and how I believe shouldn't be so much of a threat to you if we're all free to have our ideas.
That was a wonderful answer. So I want to do two things. One is a small golf clap for the tightest shorts in the building by far. Okay. It needed to be said. It could not. And now a much, much bigger clap for the amazing conversation you guys just saw.